Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you are joining for the first time, this is part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have an expert panel that is willing to share their insights and wisdom. For today, we are going to be talking about requirements management. And that's extremely boring path that you have to take, and sometimes it may not be as fun because you don't know what the ROI is of that. But you will realize ROI if you skip that step and get to the production right away. So we are going to have a lot of fun discussing that. Before we do that, we are going to start with everybody's intro, and I am going to start with my intro. I am Sam Gupta. I am principal at Elevate IQ. Elevate IQ is the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. I've been leading ERP and digital transformation engagement for roughly 20 years, and requirements management. Oh my goodness, it is always tough. On that note, I am going to start with Chris for his intro.
Hi, Sam. I'm Chris Gherardini. I'm the CEO and owner of Turnkey Technologies. I've been implementing ERP, Microsoft Dynamics ERP solutions the past 30 years. And what a great topic and what an important topic. So look forward to the conversation, everybody.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. Mark, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Be happy to, Sam. Hello and thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Lilly. I'm president and CEO of LillyWorks. We have a long history of helping manufacturers in particular with ERP systems going back to Profiki that was invented by our team, as well as visual manufacturing, now visual ERP at Infor, and LillyWorks as well. So looking forward to this conversation quite a bit.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Mark. Dave, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Absolutely. I'm very happy to be here today, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Dozer. I'm the president of Blaze IT. We're a reseller of Acumatic ERP solutions, specializing in the manufacturing industry, and very excited about today's topic and digging into the exciting world of requirements gathering. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Dave. And if you're in the audience and listening to the show right now, make sure you guys comment questions. We typically cover the questions and comments during the show. If we run out of time, we'll make sure that our panelists are going to get back to you on your questions. On that note, I am going to start with the first question. And that is going to be, Chris, I know that when we look at the requirements, I've seen both, cases. And obviously, in some ecosystems, the requirements are literally part of your product. Okay. And that's why, I'm personally a big fan of those products, because there is no way you can escape those things because it's built as part of the product. But there are only few products that actually do that. In the case of ERP, we definitely need requirements. And I have seen, for example, let's say if you look at technical systems, they typically skip the whole requirement phase, especially when it comes to new methodology called agile. Okay, just agile means, okay, dump your requirement, put it in software, and let's see how that works. So on that note, I'm going to start with you. What has been your experience when you look at the overall, requirement management? How much requirement management, and what have you seen from that perspective?
Sure, I appreciate that, Sam. So great topic, and it's a hot topic in my organization as well, since we're implementing these projects that take 6 months to 9 months. And as you think about you're going live, and somebody says, "Hey, what about this?" And they're like, "Oh, forgot." You imagine that right at go live at the 11th hour, somebody pulls something out of the hat that's critical to the business, and somebody forgot it. Right. Okay. So where does it begin? Requirements documentation and management really begins in the sales process. And if you think about how disconnected things are, and I think that's my peeve as an IT professional, and I'm looking at, okay, how do we get continuity from here all the way through the life cycle of the project? And what you're going to find is there's weakness out there. There's just not a lot of great places to do that. But what people are using Excel, but again, you think about continuity from the sales process, and I run that for people, and you go back to requirements and how are they defined, and do they make it in the contract? And a lot of times you get an RFP and then you get a contract, you're like, well, this is not embedded in this. Oh, When I do that, I'm sorry, I'm going to throw myself under the bus. I'll respond to an RFP. They're like, are you addressing that requirement? I go, well, here's what we're going to do. And you're like, well, that's not exactly everything I need. Very interesting back and forth, but that's really early on in the process. And imagine the coaching to you is, yeah, get that stuff in your contract. I mean, I put in business processes. So that in essence is the scope. And so that's another word we're going to use, AKA scope. And, ERP, it's out of the box. It should be finite. There's still gaps. People think, oh, I need all this. But capturing the gaps, capturing the requirements, capturing the nuances of the business is imperative. And again, someone's got to do it on the front of the process. You got to make sure it gets in the contract. And then, okay, we win. Whole new team shows up. Did they get that data? So again, whose responsibility is it? And I'm just telling you, there's breakdowns in the system. But as you hear me talk about early on and making sure that it gets in there and there's verification. So we're talking about the contract, project starts. What's the tool to manage it? And this is where it gets more complex. And in my world, I'm frustrated because we use Excel. That we have used Excel. And think about the tracking. So if I have, let's just call it 100 requirements, you're thinking, that's manageable. But there's 20 people on the team, 6 here, 14 over there, and guess what? Everybody's got opinions and ideas. So how do you collaborate on this 100 requirements? And then the evolution. How do you document the evolution? You think about changes and who said what and was it approved and who's approving it. So now you bring in workflow. We're looking at tools to bring in tools, just because my opinion is the Excel in the iterations on Excel where you're trying to track notes and comments where somebody's evolving this. It's not great, because what happens in the end? Dispute. Right? We got to the end of the project and, hey, you charged me a lot more money. Well, you asked for more stuff. Well, where's it documented? Or I forgot stuff. That's a bigger problem. Now you got to do it for free. Well, why? It's not like I did it in the first place, never charged for it. So think about that backside disputes and the disruption to the business, because now we had a plan go live. Someone forgot something. It's critical. It costs money. Okay, so big iterations. I could talk on this a lot. We're gonna have more discussion, but I'm gonna start there, because I think you think about workflow and approvals and documentation and specific tools when you're doing development in the code. And Stan's right about agile. They get in there, okay, now what? And they're running, and it's evolving. It's not finite, so it's a whole different. It's very hard to manage and control. So anyway, I'll let you redirect, Sam, please.
So very interesting commentary, and this is probably going to be a comment on the whole ERP community, to be honest. Okay, I don't know how many people are going to appreciate, but I'll still make it. Okay, so this is about the RFP comment that you made, and I have seen some really, really crazy RFP, and I would say 70-ish% ERP RFP. When I look at that, it's almost seems like as if you never read the original requirements and you are responding with something that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just some boilerplate, it's just crazy. So, that's when my experience seems like that's your experience as well. Now, when you get into the implementation phase, and that's where the churn starts, the bigger the project, the bigger the churn is going to be. Every meeting you are going, you have a new comment. Somebody says something. No, back off. No, you need to go back. Then, so that happens a lot. And then you sort of get lost in the requirement. Okay, what are we trying to do again after, 4 months? So you mentioned that you typically manage that process through Excel. Have you seen any other scenarios where you are simply getting lost with the requirement? Have you found any other ways of tracking, how to manage this meeting after meeting, and how to sort of freeze that?
Yeah, we're looking at a new tool. So, I don't know what to promote anybody's tool on the air here, but there's a new tool that we have that does just that, allows us to document the requirements and set up the contacts at the client side, at the partner side, and drive workflow and approvals and signatures so that we can evidence who approved something like that. And even as you generate change orders and so forth. So it's a whole level of complexity that we don't do today. And I think that's because of the disputes that we've ended up with at the end of the day. The documentation's not complete. We don't have date stamps. We don't have workflows. And so it's just awkward to coordinate. And that's it. It's awkward to coordinate people and to evidence it and to make sure that the right decisions are being made, because sometimes you have people that aren't in authority to throw in things in there that aren't really important to the company. So I think that's important too, is prioritizing but that management platform. And again, there are tools out there that are going to do that. And I think that it's imperative. And if your partner doesn't use one and you're doing a project, ask for it. That's part of the reason we're having the show, is to tell you this is a bomb, and it shows up and nobody wins with that. So, but please, any other points, Sam?
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for the commentary. So I'm actually going to move to Mark now. Mark, so when we look at this whole requirement management, and sometimes I feel that, you know what, maybe we are too tight. Maybe we should be collaborating a lot more. Okay. And then I am actually going to go back to Chris's point that when it comes to the accountability, because everything has dollar attached to it. And when we talk about dollars, that's where, you know, it's not going to be a fun conversation with anybody. Right. So until you are collaborating, you know, happy moment is great. But when you talk about the dollar conversation, that's where it gets tricky. And, you know, we have seen tools such as companies are promoting, you know what, software companies should be on Slack. They should not be on email. And as we all know that Slack is not a documented proof as such, right? In email, at least you can go back, you can find, okay, who said what, and then you have some accountability there. So in your experience, when you look at the whole requirement piece, what do you typically see that is working? What do you typically see that is not working?
I think to go back to one of Chris's points, it all has to start in the sales cycle. And I think if anybody who's been through an ERP sales cycle, certainly the implementation, but the sales cycle too, understands there's all sorts of different approaches by different organizations. You know, some ERP suppliers are just really eager to show their software. Others want to take a more methodical approach. Others may suggest even a paid consulting service to put together an RFP. So if there is a requirements list, if there's an RFP and then there's a requirements list, right? If there's an RFP, I think it's imperative to understand, you know, who created that and what process did they go through to create it, right? Because I think probably others on this panel have seen, you know, maybe a selection consultant was hired, and we've seen some selection consultants who do really excellent due diligence, and they work with the client to walk through the procedures, and they understand, and they may start with a template, but they'll narrow that template down to what's important to the client, what areas are going to be key, which ones apply and which don't. I mean, some of these templates start with, you know, 10,000 or more, you know, a spreadsheet of 10,000 or more items. It's crazy. It's the selection consultants, and there aren't many, but we've seen them over time where, you know, you walk into one sales cycle of a client, you see the template, you walk into the next one with the same consultant, and it's just the same template. You know, it's been obvious that they haven't done their due diligence to really work with the client. In my experience, the best approach is for the whether it's the channel partner or the software supplier to themselves, because they're the ones who really know the business, in particular, channel partner who's doing implementations or within their organization, they're doing implementations, to meet with the client for and invest the time, whether it's a day on site, whether it's maybe multiple days on site, to do a discovery, to understand what the processes are, what's important to the client, what's not. And that's a big thing too, because it's nice to have the full breadth of requirements that's necessary. But what's really important, especially when it comes to decision-making time, is which ones are most important, right? Because there's so many. I mean, and again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But you get, if there's somebody in the organization who just has to have a certain field and, I don't know, the purchasing module a certain way, right? And that's like the most critical item. Whereas, you know, there's some other functionality that's actually going to have more benefit to the business overall and help them grow, then that might be the criteria upon which you want to make the decision.
Okay, amazing insights there. So obviously the sales cycle is important. Everything starts, you know, from the sales cycle. And I have seen all kinds of sales cycle. In some cases, people are going to be super comprehensive, and sometimes they are worrying about things like, how do you process your sales order? Nobody cares for it, you know. The sales order is probably going to be similar. I mean, you know, there is not really a differentiator among the ERP system. Sure, you may want to look at, okay, how is the overall feel of the system? But as such, that's not really the differentiator or the make or break for the implementation. So sales cycle, you know, in my experience, when I look at the implementation requirements, that's a different ball game altogether, because you have to use the system for your business. You know, sales cycle is sure, you know, it's great, but I mean, that doesn't really speak for the implementation. So do you want to contrast the sales cycle with the implementation as well, in terms of how the requirement gathering is going to be slightly more different? Because here you might have 10,000 line items. They can lead to a lot of different functions, but when you actually go into the implementation, that's where you want to make sure that the system is working for the business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the same thing applies, right? So the organizations that are aligned where you have a sales handoff, right? The sales and maybe even the sales folks have brought in consultants in the sales cycle. I mean, because you're going to have to do the work in one part or another, right? To do that due diligence and walk through and understand what the processes look like, make sure the client understands where they want to go with the software and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would just reiterate, even if you're at the start or of the implementation, is you can't focus on everything, right? Yeah, you have a full ERP to implement, but what's important is that while you're in the weeds, always remember that there's the top 3 or 4 items that we want to get out of this implementation. How is the business performance going to improve by implementing these new processes that the software is going to support for us?
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights, Mark. So I'm actually going to come to Dave. Dave, from your experience, I mean, when you look at the larger implementation, the requirement management becomes very, very, very complex. And you have to have very disciplined approach overall in terms of how you manage the requirement, because you have to deal with a lot more politics, to be honest. And it's not fun. It's not fun at all. They're always fighting, okay? In the smaller space, it might be slightly easier. So I don't know, when you go from implementation 1 to implementation 2, have you seen any sort of best practices that you follow, that, okay, you did implementation 1, you weren't happy with it because something didn't go right, and then you sort of tailored the process in the implementation 2. So what has been your experience overall from the requirement management perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely an iterative process, and just from a reseller standpoint, I think it's something that we're even constantly learning and getting better at, and figuring out the appropriate way to manage it. Because one of the big kind of issues, for lack of a better term, I think that I've run into through the course of my career is, anytime you're really talking about requirements, even when you have a defined list, if it's the 10,000 things, or especially as you get into the implementation and you're getting into, that specific field that purchasing needs, or, on the sales order side, we need this very specific flow, you're still at the end of the day communicating and dealing with people, talking to people. So the big issue, if things aren't really spelled out in a very clear and concise manner, then what ends up happening is a lot of times a lot of assumptions are made, and someone kind of glosses over something and says something to the effect of, I kind of works this way, and you think you understand, and then you get into it's time to implement and go live, and you're like, whoa, we were way off base with this. So it's really about getting very detailed, keeping that list of requirements, making sure you're checking them off as you're going through that implementation process, down to a field level, down to a process level, and really understanding that everything is totally covered.
Okay, very interesting. So when you capture these requirements, I mean, there are always going to be different perspectives of the requirements as well. For example, let's say if you are dealing with an executive who has never implemented an ERP system, they will not know how to get into the details. For them, I'm looking for my sales reports. Technical people, you figure it out. If you give them too much information, it's just too much information for them. But in their head, they are thinking, this is what I'm expecting. They are never going to narrate that. So how do you overcome that barrier that, okay, this guy is something, he or she is expecting something in their head. They just don't know how to articulate it. Okay. And then you have to deal with it. How would you deal with it?
Exactly. And that's really when it's up to us from a consultative side to, have that really detailed list, and really kind of have the people skills in that sense to go through and make sure that we're kind of pulling. Like sometimes it's not a push type of conversation, you kind of have to pull the information out, and, having that set of questions, going back to having lived it, having that experience and knowing exactly what to ask, really kind of deep diving before you even get into, anything technical, and saying, hey, what about this, what about this, do you need to see sales this way, do you need to see sales by salesperson, because it is very different by organization. So you've got to ask those questions as you're getting into those detailed requirements, and then document all of that. So through the process, you have the information you need to effectively implement.
Okay, amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Dave, for that. So, Abu, I'm actually going to come to you, and obviously, I want you to introduce because you could not introduce before. But the question I'm going to have for you is going to be when you are working with these executives, and sometimes ERP implementation, as you know, how much attention you are going to require. It's really a commitment, and when you are doing the requirement gathering, and the executive goes like this, okay, the phone, they are just playing on the phone, and how that requirement discovery is going to be. And I'm like, okay, why am I here? Why am I working with this customer? It's not going to go very well. So introduce yourself and, tell us how do you deal with these situations when people don't know what is involved in the ERP implementation.
Sure. My name's Abu. I'm the founder and president here at Pani Management Tech Corp. We're based out of here at Calgary. We are resellers for Sage X3. We provide services in the food, distribution, chemical, manufacturing, you name it. And been around for 10 years. So requirement management, that's a complex topic, right? It's people they do their PhDs in requirement management, right? And then they will do their PhDs in how to elicit requirements, right? The exact issue that you are talking about. And what we have found is you can spend as many hours as you want on requirement management, trying to elicit it, there's still something going to be missed. If it's not missed, that's then I think there's a problem, right? We have missed something really big. so that's the approach that we take. So what we try to do in a best practice is, people have short attention spans. One thing that really makes a difference is the person who's asking the requirement, right? What is the experience that person has in the industry, right? So if you're talking to a food and beverage CFO, for example, is the person asking the requirements, can he ask the right questions, right? That food and beverage CFO would be thinking. So as a first step, you really have to put yourself in their shoes and think, as a CFO, what would you be needing, right? And that only comes from experience in that field. So that would be step one. The other would be what we have found is, you can spend, after a certain time, there are diminishing returns on how much time you want to spend on requirements, right? So what we typically propose is a more of a mix of waterfall and agile methodology. So you spend some time, you put in the right resource to ask the right questions, gather that basic core set of requirements, and then you run that agile kind of process in the testing phase, right? You show them the first output, you feel what's missing, and then you figure it out, right? The incremental requirements. If you try to capture all the 100 requirements in exactly the same detail, in exactly the same way the other person is thinking, I'll say good luck, right? It's never the same, right? So you ask the requirement, you understand it a certain way, then you give it to the developer, he understands it a certain way, he may be a lead developer, he gives it down the line to some other person, and by the time he says, she says, the story is radically different, right? So what we propose is have a core set of requirements, build those, and then build it incrementally during the testing phases.
Okay, amazing insights here. So, we are going to cover this question from the audience, and Abu, I want you to cover this. So I'm actually going to read out for the audience so that they understand what we are talking about here. Here we have the comment. It says, I have seen some misuse of the phrase high priority, and I could not agree more. Yes. Out in the wild, which is applicable here, I have heard, well, they are all high priority. Yes, they definitely are. There is nothing low priority. Oh, that's not how priority works. Exactly. Priority is literally ranking things. It's often impossible to get traction forward if you can't get people to actually agree that, well, okay, X actually is more important than Y. The real priorities will then drive compromise. And, again, I don't know what comment you are going to have, but as soon as you actually bring the dollar, then everything becomes low priority, to be honest. Yeah. And I like that binary discussion.
Yeah, I think, it's not that hard to classify, right? So the first thing is you ask the business, if you do not have this on day one, what's going to happen to the business, right? Is your business going to stop? No, probably not, right? Are you going to lose a customer because of that requirement? Probably not, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, it becomes, really easy to qualify it, right? And then once you start putting the dollar figures, right, then you can really see the correlation, right? If I don't spend the dollars, am I losing anything? Probably not, right? Or if you don't have this, then you're going to lose a customer, or you're going to shut down for 2 days, or you cannot provide customer service for 3 days, right? So that's how we try to prioritize things, rather than trying to drive a compromise. We let them make the decision. How are you going to, how does this requirement reflect your business, right? And that's what we found is really helpful in driving that list.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Ebu, for those insights. So, Chris, I'm actually going to come to you. And the question is going to be about dollars, obviously. And dollars is where the fun is, right? And, when you look at justifying the dollars for the requirements, as we know, in my case, whenever I go in, you are talking to marketers, they are going to have a million ideas, to be honest, and they have no idea how to cost that. Sales and marketing, they always like, I want to do this, I want to do that. And then you ask them, okay, justify that. It becomes real challenge for them. And after that, they don't want to do anything. So in your case, when you are trying to justify the ROI, what are some of the best practices that you have seen when it comes to requirement management?
Yeah, I think that is, as you outlined it, and I had an example just last night. They said, could you pull quality out of the proposal? And we're like, okay, so you want to pull quality out? And you're like, what's the value of pulling quality out where it's an in-stream manufacturing process? And you question the rationale, but there's a perfect example where, we're working in a very detailed pre-sales project plan that articulates scope. And again, you're trying to take some scope out. And as you rationalize the impact of taking scope out, they want to buy a QMS system and then build a ton of integration, which is going to cost. I think they pulled 24 grand in services out to save, and it's in the license. So, but to put another $150,000 in a third-party system, well, there's a perfect example of looking at requirements that may be natively served out of the system you're considering versus a third-party product. I mean, that's one example, but I think you're right. How do you associate a value to each of these requirements? And I think Mark made a great point. The 3,000, 10,000 requirements, it's blur. Nobody knows what's important. I mean, the person who chimed is totally accurate. And to boil down, and I think that's the comment to the audience is, be a little more reasonable and look at requirements like, okay, we need to be able to do an AP check. Great. Let's assume that most systems can do an AP check. And I think to boil it down and look at these, what we call showstoppers, meaning they're really, IP of the business. It's a secret process. It's a process that has a very effective result. Those are the things that you can't live without, because to compromise that, you're compromising real revenue. But to be able to your point about an ROI, perfect example, an AP check, no big deal. I'll buy a new check stack, not a big deal. No, it's got to look like this. Just move on. Those aren't the important factors. But as you get into those parts of the system that impact customers and the customer feels it, whether it's a portal, whether it's the way you can book a sales transaction, maybe it's the way you're maintaining price schedules, discounts, and things like that. So those are the requirements that really bubble up and have more priorities and better ROI, because you're impacting customer service, you're impacting customer experience, you're creating efficiency and interacting with customers. Those are all big things. Everybody's like, AP, we can pay people later. I'm being funny, but there's some truth to that. And even in manufacturing processes, that it's billing, it's manufacturing, it's normally that part of the business or projects where the really core requirements are. So like I said, part of that's prioritizing, but also what happens if we can't do that? Well, maybe you can't even move to the new system. So that's a great example of bubbling them up. These are showstoppers, for example. And I think understanding showstoppers and what's next, and then there's the would-be nice stuff. And then there's parking lot. You guys, know what that means? Parking lot. You put a lot of stuff. That's the wish list. But anyway, I hope that helps a little more.
No, it does. Thank you so much for that. And by the way, I mean, since you mentioned the rationale, and sometimes I'm just blown away based on the amount of requests that we get and the kind of requests that we get. And it's just fascinating that, people just don't understand how these systems work. I'll give you an example. For example, let's say if you have a technical problem that you are trying to solve, good luck explaining that to your executives. For example, let's say if you have multiple systems in your architecture and you are sort of trying to maintain the data integrity, and they are only worried about, I have my marketing automation set on HubSpot. I'm looking for 4 fields. That's it, man. Give me the 4 fields. What's the big deal? Okay. And I'm like, okay, no. Hold on. Okay. So you need to actually make sure that the systems are actually going to be talking to each other. You need to make sure the source of truth is going to be there. The information is going to be reliable. And then you can probably get that, right? So it's almost like you have to climb the mountain to get the dessert. And once you get there, then you probably have the desserts lined up there, but you have to still climb the mountain. And they just don't get it. So in your experience, how do you explain the technical problems and when you are getting these just unreasonable requests that, you know what, I want to break out the project in like super illogical way?
So different stakeholders, to your point, have different understandings, different perspectives. And I think as you go back to, they got to deal with the finance guy, he's happy. He's not worried about the operation guy's problem. But the operation guys are the crux of the business. And so to your point, you've got different stakeholders that have different priorities. And so as you go back to requirements, that's where it gets real contentious as to who's got authority to decide prioritization within an organization. That's kind of where you're driving at. And it's how do you settle those disputes? Finance and operations are going to fight. You're smiling, Mark. I'm sure you know it. It is. It's like the operation guys are like, finance, like, we're great with QuickBooks. The operation guy goes, we're struggling. We can't do these things. And again, the expectation is to scale the business. So it still comes back to rationalizing what's it cost you in terms of future growth. And these are soft numbers if you can't do this. So anyway.
Amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Chris. So Mark, I'm actually going to come to you and we are going to hammer this a little bit more since you were smiling, right? So I'm pretty sure you have some stories there that you might want to share. But overall, the conflict is one thing, okay? As long as the conflict is going to be reasonable, right? Sometimes you just get illogical requests that it's very, very, very hard to explain to executives why technical systems work in certain way and why you need to group certain requirements together for it to work. Otherwise, it's not even going to work. So have you seen anything similar in your experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think, per what Chris was saying was that there's the classic, and it's between a lot of different departments, but it's classic, the finance and operations one. And traditionally, it's gotten better over the years, I think. But even when we were younger, the finance folks were often the ones making the decision. I think oftentimes you see them kind of leading an implementation today too. But to the detriment of maybe other folks in a manufacturing environment, manufacturing company, production is the heart of the system, right? So. If the implementation requirements come down to, how many clicks does it take to process an AP invoice, right? Versus, operations, do they even have what they need in terms of creating, a structure for their product in a decent way? And I'm speaking, I think all ERP systems have that today. It's more are the services and the proposal and the whole implementation project and scope of work is that in there for those improvements to make. So when we're talking about ROI, folks often focus on cost savings, right? Which is wonderful, and then you want to look for those, certainly. But I think I am going to kind of have a rebuttal on what you said, Sam, about sales and marketing, because those are the folks who are going to drive it and say, hey, if we had, and again, most ERP systems have this tremendous capability. If we're actually able to utilize that and be able to, fill in the blank, see opportunities for more revenue, whether it's in the costing function, be able to promise better lead times, have better customer information and repeat business opportunities. You can go through the whole list. Then you're talking about, additive things, right? So now it's not so much how much are we going to save, and there are certainly those parameters, but more in terms of where are the opportunities for improvement. The fun part about that is that your opportunities for improvement is there's no ceiling, right? The potential improvement on those is infinite, right? Whereas cost savings, you can only cut so much, right? You can only save so much and not have either detrimental effects to the performance of the company, the morale of the company, or whatnot. So I would say, when you're looking at the requirements and you're configuring the ROI for it, definitely include those parameters where there are opportunities to improve and grow. And what if we could do these things? What if we could have this type of performance in the company? And that's going to motivate people too. Again, when you're stuck in the weeds and an implementation's hard, it's going to motivate them because they know ultimately they're driving some significant improvements when they come out of it 6-9 months later.
Okay, amazing insights. And I'm going to have to tell you this, Mark, okay? You have really, pressed the hot button right now because nobody challenges Sam on this show. So let's talk about, sales and marketing one, right? So sales and marketing, when you are talking about, obviously they are going to have wish list dreams. And it's really, really hard for them to justify the ROI. They just don't have that, capability to do sort of the P&L as your finance folks are going to be able to do. So in your experience, we all know that ERP brings a lot of value, okay? But to get there, you have to spend 2 years, 1 year, whatever timeline, and that's a dark, lonely, depressing road that everybody has to walk. And sometimes it becomes very, very, very challenging to convince how you are going to get value from each of the line items, especially if you are nitpicking. Okay, what is my ROI on this line item? What is my
right?
It could be really hard. So in your experience, how do you justify the value?
Sure. So goes back to the thing I said in the last segment, and that is focus on those 3 to 4 metrics you want to drive improvement on, right, throughout from the start to the end of the implementation, and once you're live, right? What are those? So bring the future into the present. Say what are those areas in the business we want to improve? How are we going to know they're improving, and how are we going to be able to measure that, right? So now here's where it gets interesting, and back to Chris and even what Abu says is where there's conflict, that's not going to happen, because as you point out, the finance folks are the ones best suited to calculate those ROIs, for even the potential opportunities that sales and marketing sees, and maybe the finance folks don't. So if we can get them all in a room and they're all cooperative and they're open to each other's ideas, now that's when the synergy happens, right? That's when you start to help, where they're helping each other out, getting on the same page. That's where you're going to drive significant performance improvement.
Amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Mark, for that. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I didn't perfectly answer your question. I got a story I'll share with you. It's a technical. So you said about the technical thing, and I got a great example where I ran a deal with a drone manufacturer. And you think about SolidWorks, CAD engineering, manufacturing. And so for people that are in that space, that the engineers are over here, items, bombs, configurations, routing, ERPs over here. They don't talk out of the box. I recommended a solution that fully integrates two-way CAD to ERP, but not just a little bit, but invasively, and actually adds more real estate inside of the F&O application for ITAR compliance and so forth. And I think the point of this is, you look at the price, you're like, oh my gosh, it's too expensive. However, the rationalization, and we're talking about documents and quality and all of that stuff pervasively just syncing automatically. And if we have in-flight, we're building a drone, we got updates, we got revisions, it deals with all the in-flight, everything. You break that, or you just don't have that, and the articulation of how much manual work it takes to propagate changes through manufacturing. And I think there's a perfect example where you got the finance guys like, I don't get it, and you get the operations guys. And I started with that, but this is a perfect real life example, and it's not just a simple CAD to ERP integrations, it's a very robust. But if you think about that particular scenario and trying to really rationalize, well, how much manual effort? It's game changing if you eliminate all that manual rework. And a lot of people have a hard time really anticipating that until they make the bad decision to get over there. So anyway, I just want to add that comment.
Okay, amazing comment there. Mark, do you have any follow-up comments on that by any chance, or?
No, yeah, I absolutely agree. It's all about, the improvements that you're going to find, and the biggest ROIs are going to happen when you improve the flow of information, right? So absolutely getting the right information to the right people in the right time, through the roof.
Yeah,
Great story.
Go ahead, Abu.
So I can add a comment on ROI, right? So ROI is perceived differently by different people in the organization, right? So for example, if you're a finance, senior executive, and you have to do board reporting, they want to run a report and they want to see all the data right away. But guess what? You don't have that data being captured. So when you're doing the implementation now, you're going to force the people on the front line, for example, on the production floor, to start capturing time, by the minute, by the second. You want them to capture time at each and every step. And now their process has slowed down, right? So they are used to picking up the product without any time entry. I just want to ship it out. So when they are looking at it, their ROI is, it has gone down, but the finance team ROI has gone up, right? So it's those kind of conflicts which become really difficult to resolve, and oftentimes the executives win. But that's where the perception of ROI also changes, right? So it's fairly complicated, right? So
Yeah, could not agree more. So, we have been picking a lot about salespeople. For sales and marketing, it's always going to be game changing. Everything is game changing. But now we have to pick on our finance people as well, to be honest, just to make it fair to everyone. So for finance, it's very, very, very hard for them to see. And I'm going to have to agree with Chris's point. I think he did mention about that aspect that, I'm fine, QuickBooks, no problem whatsoever. But the operations is not able to really ship those products. So for them, it's a nightmare. And they just don't see it. So let's see. And by the way, sales and marketing, forget about it. Whatever sales and marketing is going to talk about it. Now, finance is doing literally nickel and dime for, okay, what is my ROI? And they're like, okay, you don't get it. Forget it. I'm not going to do it. Just let's move on. And I'm going to move on to my spreadsheet. And, then you'll figure it out how ROI works. Because then you are going to get all of that admin cost. So in your experience, when you're looking at the ROI management of the requirements, have you seen any specific best practices where you are not doing the nickel and dime, but you still have some sort of, perspective of ROI at a broader level, as opposed to getting down into like being
yeah,
really specific?
I mean, I don't think you can get down to try to calculate ROI for each and every requirement, right? It becomes, lethargic, it becomes hard, and, that's all you'll be doing every day, right? So, I mean, to me, it boils down to why are you going for a new system? What are the broad, high-level strategic items that decided you to, you know, adopt this new system? That could be, to serve your customers better. You get a customer inquiry in, and you cannot answer those customer inquiries questions right away, for example, right? Because your systems are disconnected. You have finance for QuickBooks, you have a different system for fulfilling sales, you are doing manually your inventory, right? So that is what it boils down to, right? Or did you get a new system because your board wants to have better reporting, right? So if you want better reporting for your board, for example, your financial board, then you have to capture more data. So that capturing more data will definitely mean that people at the front line have to spend more time doing administrative tasks, right? So you're going to lose some of that speed and efficiency over there, but that means you get better data, upfront for your financial people, right? So again, it boils down to why did we go for this implementation? What are the 5 or 6 broad strategic objectives we want to achieve? And is that requirement fulfilling that objective, or is it not adding any value to that objective? Would be the way I would see it.
Okay, amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Abu, for that. So, Chris, I am going to come to you, and I don't know if you're going to have any other stories that you might be able to share related to requirement management. But one of the things that I'm probably going to pick on what Abu has mentioned about the sort of using the hybrid approach in terms of agile versus waterfall. And agile has very different ways of capturing the requirements. You are going to have sort of the user stories, and you have the persona. Sometimes that adds a lot of colors. It gives a lot of context in terms of who's talking and what they really need. But that becomes slightly more, and you mentioned that requirements are supposed to be managed in the spreadsheet, because that's going to be far more manageable over from the management perspective. So do you typically prefer slightly more waterfall approach where you are going to get just the description, or do you like more of the user story format for the ERP requirements?
Sure, great question. And I think as we've looked at traditionally, we've done full waterfall on our ERP projects, but the new model that we're attacking on a couple of deals is the analysis phase and even the design phase from a analysis and configuration can be waterfall, and then we roll through agile as we get into development phases and operations. So they're working on a new hybrid methodology for our projects as well. But yeah, the analysis phase is waterfall. There's just nothing to say about that. And those workshops, and they end up yielding again a complete, very detailed listing of every process and scope and the scenario deviations, what's a gap, but that's at the end of the analysis phase. So, but it is a waterfall in the front end of the process. But now they're looking at, again, in the development cycles, we can run agile within a waterfall structure is what they're going to be doing. So
So let's talk about the story building, right? And
Sure.
when we look at the agile story, they have a lot of different contexts. It is going to have a little bit of persona, and it's going to have the benefit that you are getting from the outcome, basically, that you are getting from the story. So how do you do that in waterfall? Do you have you seen yourself struggling in terms of building that context in the form of story? Because the story has a little bit of meaning to it, right? And
Sure.
that's an improved way of looking at the requirements. So do you experience that? Do you not?
It's evolving. My opinion is we don't have enough. I think that we do a good job of capturing it down to that level, and but it's insufficient because we don't have the routings, the approvals, and we don't have all the signatures and stuff. And so what happened is there's scope creep, and there's, oh, that's supposed to be there, and so you get into this subjective critique of it. And again, it's what's the single source of truth, and that's why we're going to move upstream to this platform that'll manage all that content for us. And but yeah, it's worked well. We've gotten down to those discussions, and they still use DevOps for certain aspects of our projects, mostly on the development stuff though, not on the configuration of the ERP systems though. So
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. So, Mark, I'm actually going to come to you. And in terms of overall, let's say if you are managing very complex projects, for the requirement management, and let's say if Chris is managing his requirement in a spreadsheet, I don't know how many different spreadsheets are going to be there, and what is going to be a clear way of segmenting that so that people can follow along. Okay, which is this spreadsheet? Otherwise, you may end up with thousands of spreadsheets, and you have no idea which has what. So, in your experience, when you look at the ERP project, do you have any specific way of segmenting how you should be segmenting these spreadsheets?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most obvious one we've used is just by functional area, right? Sales, production, and then break them down into sub areas and subcategories. Whether it's an item master or BOM or routings, and then just go deep into each one of those. So, and then there's typically some sort of mapping between, whether formal or informal, between the functional areas and the folks, the staff, and the leadership, where each functional area reports, and that can be very telling too, just understanding that, and who's actually leading each functional area, who's reporting to whom, across those areas too, can be quite telling. But once you get there, again, from an ROI perspective, drilling down into them, and per what Abu said, it's kind of, you've got different priorities with different folks, and ultimately you just have to cover what you can, but be sure the most important one. So I do have a brief story on a recent implementation we saw where. And this company, they're not a big company, they're a smaller company, but they had an outside consultant come in, with a great guy, and they worked through their implementation, their process, had great plans, did their piloting, got everything done. And really the whole approach was, and I'm saying this in retrospect, looking back, the approach was that the president in particular was basically hands off, right? It's just, he's good, and whatever the consultant and the leadership under him said was good. So it was going along. And so they got to go live, and the week after go live, the president realizes his inventory is millions of dollars higher than it was previously. Well, that's because before in QuickBooks they were managing it on a material only cost, right? And now all of a sudden they have everything with labor and overhead embedded in it. So it comes over, and your inventory is significantly higher. So luckily he didn't have cardiac arrest or anything when he saw the numbers, but we got him through it together. But so they had to rework some things and do some education post facto.
So amazing insights there. And I am actually going to touch on one of the comments that you made about hands off. I see two scenarios. Again, this is going to be slightly more binary. Okay, so we see either two hands off or two hands on. Okay, it's never sort of that balance, because if you are going to be a smaller company, if you have been involved with every function, then you are probably going to be micromanaging everything. Okay, and sometimes that becomes annoying because you don't really have that perspective of getting into the detail, the way the implementation is going to work. And sometimes it's just so hands off that you are not even involved, you don't even care. And sometimes when you have to make these larger decisions, and you're like, do you really understand this? Okay, right. And they just don't care. And finally you are going to break the implementation, and then they obviously are going to yell at you So how do you manage this hands-on versus hands-off, and how do you explain their responsibility that they need to be part of the requirement management phase?
Yeah, it's a great point. And in retrospect, we obviously we should have, as our consulting team should have pushed a little bit more to get at least some some attention throughout the implementation process. Maybe not full involvement, but at least some formal check-ins. Like, here we are, here's what we're deciding, here's our path going forward, and that sort of thing. Just so they're aware. And I think to a certain degree, it does make it difficult for the implementer, the channel partner, for example, to do that. If there is an outside consultant, you're kind of relying on the outside consultant to have some of those. So I think in retrospect, we would have pushed a little more on the outside consultant to coordinate that kind of a three-way and have those checkpoint meetings would have prevented that type of scenario.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Mark, for that. So, Abu, I'm actually going to come to you, and I am probably going to have similar question. If you have seen any sort of best practices overall in how you would segment the requirements, how you would version the documents, if there is, one way that is going to be better than the other, overall approval accountability is going to be a big deal. I don't know how you manage that. I don't want to get into that, but maybe you can tell me a story about that as well.
Sure. I mean, we find it's extremely hard to manage on Excel sheets, right? You can't add comments, you cannot route it, cannot add, it becomes hard to add any diagrams, pictures. So, we personally, as our organization, we have moved away from Excel. We tend to do it more, tools like Jira, for example, they are much better at managing those requirements than you can have with approval workflows around that as well. What we also typically do is we'd share our requirement management tool access with our clients, and that way they can manage, they can see those requirements in the tools, they can leave their comments in it, they can provide approval workflows within those requirements as well. I mean, so the other way, again, then you also have to segment within Jira, right? So Jira or some tool like that is just a requirement capturing tool. You can do functional, aspects as well. For example, finance requirements or manufacturing. The difficulty that comes often in those aspects is, purchasing requirements are going to affect finance requirements and vice versa, right? So you need a credit hold. Finance requires a credit hold, for example. It's going to affect how you process a sales order. So where do you place those requirements, right? Is it a sales requirement or is it a finance requirement, right? So you run into those difficulties. We try to get around it by defining more like procure to pay process, for example, and then assigning ownership on the requirements, within requirements itself. So again, it's a complicated, requirement management. Segmenting is always complicated. It's what kind of company it is, right? Some companies are only going to use one system. They do not have very complicated requirements. Then it becomes easy to do it, solo segment, broad-based finance, manufacturing, distribution. If they're interacting with 5 different systems, Chris talked about CAD/CAM systems integrating with ERP. Now suddenly it affects, bill of materials. It's going to affect finance. It's going to affect purchasing, because the engineer is going to design a bill of material, push it to the ERP, and the purchasing person is going to use that bill of material to buy raw materials for the projects, right? So where those requirements go in, right? Is it an engineering requirement or is it a purchasing requirement, right? So it's that cross-functional, where requirements become cross-functional, become difficult to manage. Then you have to go down to a more process level, right? It's a procurement process. Okay, where does the procurement process start? It starts when the engineer designs a high-level BOM for a quote purpose, right? So you have to look at it that way, and you really have to analyze what is the end client, what is the complexity of the end client, and what makes sense for them, right? So that's our approach generally.
Okay, amazing insights there. So I am going to have a little comment there, on the tool and the Jira, and I absolutely love these tools because they are going to provide far more control that you are going to get in the Microsoft Office. So you are right. The challenge that I typically run into, and I don't know, how complex your engagements are. In our case, we have 5 10, 15 companies as part of the same engagement. And if they all bring their own tools, sometimes it becomes a nightmare. Okay, you are doing Jira now, you want me to use Jira, and now, a spreadsheet. So it becomes very challenging. So have you seen that as well? That when multiple companies, and I don't know if there is a way for, let's say, you bring Jira to the equation, then can other companies get into your Jira to be able to manage? How do you overcome that barrier?
So so it depends, right? So if you're a company where 15 vendors are involved, then likely that's a larger client, right? Then the client should be enforcing that tool, right? So it would be their ownership tool, and then every vendor is putting the requirements or interacting in that tool, right? So obviously there's, if I have my own tool, then I can't really, giving access to 15 vendors become difficult, right? Then who owns the data post go live as well, right? So in that situation, it is probably best that the client owns the tool rather than the vendor owning the tool, right? In situations where the vendor is leading all those 15 subcontractors, right? So they're not working all independently with the end client, but we have a main master vendor, master service agreement vendor, and they are bringing in all these 5 or different. Then it's that master service agreement vendor who should be providing the tool and then asking their sub vendors to integrate into it, right? So again, it depends on the end situation, really, right? Some organizations are more advanced; they will enforce that we use their tools. Oftentimes they are not. Then you bring in the biggest vendor, bring in their own tool. Be my opinion.
Amazing insights there. So right now, the only thing we can Chris, do you have a comment?
Yeah, the tool that we were looking at is Jama Connect. So I've heard about Jira, and the guy that's running my services delivery said Jama Connect. So I don't know if you've looked at that one, Abu, but I think that our premise would be we'd own it, we'd license it out to the vendors, the customers, anybody participating, but we would own it. But it's a great point that should the customer own it? Great point. Great point.
And how would you overcome that? So let's say you have the Jama Connect, and then the customer needs to own. So would you transfer the license and the project to the customer?
I'm not that far down the road. I think that if we put the platform up, we'd use it to manage the projects and connect everybody that's involved in the project and coordinate them. But we would own that, and unless they wanted to say, hey, we want to license it. But I think that's a great point, Abu. I didn't think about presenting that as a pitch to the customers to bring that in-house. They should own it. It would benefit them to keep all of that detail and use it to manage other projects internally, frankly. I think that's a value add. So it's a great point. And I guess my closing line is get a requirements management tool. Enough said. Go Google it. They're out there.
Okay, amazing advice there. Thank you so much, Chris, for the closing advice. Mark, what would be your closing advice, please?
Just to reiterate, focus on those top 3 or 4 objectives and goals. Where do you want to be 6 to 9 months, even further out once you're live on the system? What do you want to be able to do then that you can't today? And what impact is that going to have on your business?
Okay, amazing advice there. Thank you so much, Mark, for that. Abu, what would be your closing advice, please?
I think you have to find a happy medium in terms of requirement gathering. I've seen clients who would not spend any time at all on requirement gathering, and then they don't like what they see at the end. And then there are clients who would spend so much time on requirement gathering that they never go to the testing or the go live phase, right? So it's really figuring out your situation and figuring out that medium where you get enough depth in the requirements so that you can go to the next phase, but not also go down, bog down, or having a completely different end product. So
okay, amazing advice there. So guys, that's it for today. If you joined for the first time, this was part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have an expert panel that is willing to share their insights and wisdom. So make sure you are not going to miss next week's show. We are going to be here. On that note, thanks again for your insights and wisdom tonight, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
all right, thanks everyone.